When I first read The Midnight Library, I cried multiple times, and when I was finished, I found myself severely disappointed that the author had not written any other fiction. And yet, even at the time, I had complaints about the book. With time, I have found that these have only grown, and the book has continued to sour on me. But the thing that finally decided me to make a video about it is that Copilot seems to think that quite strongly it belongs in a category of books I have described as getting out of my own head books. I've asked Copilot at least 3 times now for more books that fit the pattern, and The Midnight Library has come up at least twice, more than any other book except The Little Prince and The Life of Pi. Now this obviously says something about the limitations of AI models. Copilot is really bad at finding books in the categories that I use to think about books anyways. I use it only because it's still often less bad in many cases than Amazon's also-read suggestions, and because I don't know many people who can recommend the kind of books I want to read. And it's pretty understandable to me why Copilot keeps thinking The Midnight Library believes in the same category as Kahlil Gibran's The Prophet, Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, and C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. Indeed, there are very likely humans who would put The Midnight Library in a category with these other books, on the grounds that they are all inspirational, uplifting fiction with heavy elements of philosophy and self-help, and that they have all been extremely popular. The reason I would absolutely not put The Midnight Library in a category with these other books is that I think the message of the book is both bad and badly conveyed. That is to say, I think it is trying to offer some very specific advice, and it is presenting it in a fashion that is ham-fisted and kind of insulting. I loved the book on first reading because it made me cry, because it made me feel seen and validated, but it has never made me think. Or rather, it has only made me think about why I think the message of this book is so bad. And the thing is, I think that there are some books where the purpose is simply to make you feel strong emotions, and if that is what this book was supposed to be, it would be perfectly fine for what it was. Indeed, if you struggle with depression and just want a book to make you cry and feel seen while you're reading it, it may still be worth reading on that basis. But looking at the way that the book is written and the non-fiction books Matt Haig has written, it's clear the book was supposed to be a book in the vein of The Alchemist or The Great Divorce. And so I would argue that I do not think Matt Haig understood what makes books like that work, and so he managed to write a book that was, on one hand, deeply cathartic for many people struggling with depression on first read, but which is ultimately not just shallow in its plot and message, but frankly, kind of condescending. Now, I'm not the first person to make a Midnight Library bad video. However, the booktuber in the video I watched on the subject was somewhat dismissive of what he called live, laugh, love books in general. He recognized that The Alchemist was a better book than The Midnight Library, but he did not seem to quite understand what makes The Alchemist and books like it good. I have been reading a lot of C.S. Lewis, and one thing that Lewis quite strongly believed is that people who do not appreciate what makes other people appreciate a thing are poorly positioned to criticize the bad versions of it. That is to say, if you do not appreciate an art form at its best, you are in no position to criticize it at its worst. This is something I believe to some extent myself, and at my writing critique group I increasingly opt out of all but the most obvious feedback for works people bring in subgenres that I have never appreciated, and even with the feedback I give I caveat that I'm not the target audience. Now I personally do love the kind of book that The Midnight Library was clearly trying to be, and this lets me see just why I think it is so bad at being that. This is especially the case now that I have had the opportunity to contrast it with 2 books with somewhat similar themes. The first of these is The First 15 Lives of Harry August by Claire North, which was recommended to me by a friend when I started to complain about how The Midnight Library was souring on me. The other is The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. Amazingly, Copilot has managed to resist recommending C.S. Lewis when I've asked about getting out of my own head books until I discovered him myself, but once I did, it seized on my inclusion of The Great Divorce in the prompt to again recommend The Midnight Library as a similar book. Obviously, this book will include spoilers for the ending of The Midnight Library, but honestly, the author sets up the book from pretty much the beginning such that it is very clear that there is only one way that it can end anyways. When I initially finished the book, I said that both the choice of ending and the way that it was set up such that it was the only possible ending were the only flaws in an otherwise amazing book. But as I have thought on it more, and as I have explicitly contrasted it with the class of books that I call getting out of my own head books, it has become clear to me that Matt Haig had a very clear message he wanted to convey with this book, and shaped the entire book around conveying that message. The message of the book seems to be something like this: your best possible life is the one that you have already lived. So start where you are and embrace the fact that the rest of your life starts right now. The problem is that the central conceit of the Midnight Library is that you can choose to try living as many alternative lives as you want, lives where you made one decision differently, but you will inevitably find that the only life that you can actually live is the one that you have already lived. As a strictly practical matter, this is true. We cannot change the past. But if we could, most people would absolutely have alternative lives that they lived better and would fit better in than where they are now. Because of the message that Haig wants to convey, the promise of the Midnight Library is a lie. You cannot, in fact, ever choose to stay in a different life. This is not only because Haig chose to make nearly all of the protagonist's alternative lives worse, and to make the one good life she found feel entirely unearned. It is also because the moment you feel any disappointment with an alternative life, you are yanked out of that life, never to return. It is an entirely unrealistic standard, and one that contrasts quite sharply with the message that we should live with the numerous disappointments of the lives we have made thus far, simply because they are ours. Because of the message that Haig wants to convey, the library itself feels like a sadistic genie, and in that there is an element of horror that grows the more you think about it. Now, I would not call the first 15 lives of Harry August a getting out of my own head book, although perhaps when I reread it I will change my mind. While Cry the Beloved Country has been my favorite novel since I read it, I did not place it in that category until I recently reread it. The thing about the first 15 lives of Harry August is that it is trying to tell a story first. If there's a moral, it's not the point of the book. Rather, the book is an exploration of what a society of people who relive their own lives over and over might look like. Like I said, I'm reading a lot of C.S. Lewis right now, and so I cannot help but think of his advice that anyone who is capable of writing a book without a moral should do so. There are people who would argue that The Alchemist has a moral, and indeed that is often what they criticize about it. But as I said in my last video, I think that if it has a moral, it in fact has several, and none of them are the point of the book. On the other hand, despite his own advice, I think it's clear that The Great Divorce does have a sort of a moral, though it's still perhaps not the main point. If I were to pick one central point out of that book, I think it would be that hell is what we make for ourselves, because we cannot let go of our own failings stemming from our own past traumas. The message of The Great Divorce, then, is in some sense the antithesis of that of the Midnight Library. Haig's message seems to be essentially, let go of the past because you can't change it, and instead focus on the future. Lewis, in contrast, says that we must go back to the past, to where we went wrong, in order to then set ourselves right. Obviously, it is not possible to either relive your life or to move to a life where you have made different choices, and so Lewis is metaphorical here, but his argument is remarkably similar to what Arthur Koestler has argued for in terms of improving ourselves in his books The Act of Creation and The Ghost in the Machine, that we must regress to an earlier state in order to progress to higher ones. Meanwhile, the difference in the conceptions of the mechanisms behind the Midnight Library and the first 15 lives of Harry August is telling. Harry August and the other characters who can relive their lives can learn from their experiences and try new paths. Stepping into a life that you have lived differently but don't remember living is unearned, as Haig makes very clear. He is putting his thumb on the scale here by choosing that strategy as opposed to reliving all or part of your life. And yet, even so, C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce explicitly argues that accepting unearned grace is hard, and giving yourself grace you haven't earned is harder, and that's precisely why you should learn to do it. Moreover, we might not feel comfortable stepping into a life where we made all the right decisions, but I think most of us would be perfectly comfortable stepping into a life where we made a few critical decisions differently, where we either should have known better than to make those decisions at the time, or we would have made them differently if we had known then what we know now. Haig depends on deliberately writing alternative lives that are either clearly worse or clearly unearned, and yanking the protagonist out at the moment that she has any disappointment. He does this to try to convince us that if we had the chance, we should not really want to step into a life where we made better decisions, in order to sell us on living our best lives starting now. In every aspect of every decision Haig made in designing the library, it is rigged so that the protagonist must choose her old life or death. But such a forced choice is no choice at all, and yet it seems much crueler than the simple reality we live in of not even having the illusion of the possibility of a do-over. Like I said, reading this book made me cry because it made me feel seen. A lot of Nora's regrets are similar to regrets I have myself. Haig himself has struggled with depression. Like Haig, I believe that we all have only this life, and we need to figure out how to make the most of it starting from the decisions we've already made. But unlike Haig, I recognize that things are not as simple as deciding that the rest of your life starts today. I recognize that to move forward, we often need to move backwards, to work on changing the habits we've ingrained that have led to us making decisions we regret. In contrast, the central theme of The Great Divorce is about how hard it is to overcome those habits, such that some people might remain trapped in a hell of their own making, even giving a literal eternity to work on themselves. C.S. Lewis believed in immortal souls, an afterlife, and the possibility of salvation, these being some of the central points of Christianity. And yet, in making the case for embracing his conception of Christianity, he made a very compelling case for how and why to try to live your life better starting now, whatever you believe about what happens after death. The Alchemist, too, is often about making hard choices and breaking from old habits, while The Prophet is about changing the way in which we view things. In a way, I'm realizing every book I would describe as a getting out of my own head book is in some fashion about changing habits, but generally more by showing than by telling. Moreover, I think the writers of those books implicitly or explicitly recognize that most people probably have no interest in following the model they are laying out, and that those who wish to follow that model will still struggle. Such books are meant to be inspirational and aspirational, not prescriptive, and part of the inspiration comes from telling a good story. In contrast, The Midnight Library is clearly prescriptive and seemingly meant to be motivational, but I would say that it is not really inspirational and it is quite explicitly anti-aspirational. Haig is not offering a model that he knows many people will aspire to but not take, which he knows many others will reject outright. Rather, he seems to be presenting a model that he thinks any depressed person should be able to follow, because it's so basic and so simple. Just remember that the rest of your life starts now, and live accordingly. And yet, Haig is seemingly so focused on what he wants to tell his audience that he does not think through why and how on more than a very superficial level. Speaking as a person who has struggled with depression intermittently since 5th grade, taking those first steps always feels incredibly hard, and taking a bunch of them at once makes the changes extremely hard, if not impossible, to maintain. Indeed, if Nora isn't allowed to stay in her alternative lives at the feeling of the slightest disappointment, how much harder will it be to keep up the changes she has made in her old life in the face of much greater disappointments? Haig conveys in his book beautifully what it's like to be depressed, but absolutely fails to convey what it's like to actually pull oneself out of depression. He presumably did so himself, but he then seems to have forgotten just how hard it was to do so. I think there is a book that could have been written which conveyed what Haig sought to convey in a compelling way. But I think that such a book would need more reasonable rules for the library, would need to acknowledge that many, likely most people, would be happier in many alternative versions of their lives, legitimately happier. Nora would need to meaningfully choose to return to her original life, not because it was her only real option, but because she was special and she chose it. Honestly, I think the choice might be even more meaningful if she found that her original life was closed to her, but that she could return to one that was almost like it, perhaps slightly better or slightly worse. Indeed, it occurs to me that the cult movie Wristcutters, A Love Story conveyed much the same messages I think Haig wanted to convey, using a similar conceit. But the crucial point is that it needs to be, this is Nora making this choice because it's best for her, not, this is Nora making literally the only choice she could make and still live. Perhaps in other versions of his own Midnight Library, Haig actually wrote such a book that really is made of the same stuff as The Prophet, The Alchemist, or The Great Divorce. Regrettably, however, we will only ever know the book that he wrote in this version of his life.